It was a Saturday like any other, or so it seemed. The kind of day that feels like an invitation to relax, unwind, and enjoy some time for yourself. But for Laura, this particular Saturday would become something entirely different. Instead of spending the day with a cup of coffee in hand, she was about to take a step into something that would change her life in a way she never expected. What started as a simple act of kindness turned into an unforgettable encounter that would leave her questioning what it means to give and what it means to receive. It all began when Laura noticed Mrs. Parker, her elderly neighbor, struggling to carry groceries up to her front porch. Laura had lived next to Mrs. Parker for several years, always exchanging friendly waves and quick hellos, but never really taking the time to get to know each other deeply. She knew that Mrs. Parker lived alone, and that the years were starting to take their toll, but life was busy, and sometimes it was easy to overlook those around us who needed help. That Saturday, though, something felt different. As Laura stood on her porch watching Mrs. Parker struggle with the bags, a sudden sense of urgency hit her. Without even thinking about it, she rushed over and offered to help. Mrs. Parker, with her weathered smile and thankful eyes, welcomed the help without an hesitation. It was in that moment that Laura realized something. Mrs. Parker's struggle wasn't just about carrying groceries. It was about a much larger challenge, one that a lot of elderly people face every day. The simple tasks that many of us take for granted can become overwhelming, even impossible. And as Laura unloaded the bags and helped her neighbor into her home, she saw how much more Mrs. Parker needed, beyond the occasional friendly gesture. She found herself thinking, what if I could do more? What if, instead of just offering quick help here and there, she could make a real difference in Mrs. Parker's life? That afternoon, Laura didn't just stop with the groceries. She saw Mrs. Parker's home, filled with piles of things that needed organizing and cleaning. Dust had settled in every corner, and it was clear that Mrs. Parker's mobility had been limited for quite some time. It wasn't just a matter of a few dirty dishes or scattered papers. It was a home that had been slowly overtaken by years of living and little help. It was an overwhelming sight, but instead of turning away, Laura felt compelled to help. She asked Mrs. Parker if she could clean up for her, and although Mrs. Parker hesitated, she agreed with a soft, grateful nod. As Laura picked up the cleaning supplies and got to work, she felt the weight of the situation. It wasn't just a house that needed cleaning. It was the feeling of loneliness and isolation that sometimes accompanies growing old. Mrs. Parker had lived in that house for decades, and over the years, it seemed like the world had forgotten about her. But Laura wasn't about to let her neighbor feel that way for another minute. The afternoon slipped into evening as Laura worked tirelessly, moving from room to room, scrubbing surfaces, dusting shelves, and wiping down countertops. With each task, she felt a deep connection to the home she was cleaning, almost as if it were her own. She began to imagine what it must have been like for Mrs. Parker, raising a family, filling the house with laughter and life. And now it stood empty, save for the quiet ticking of the clock on the wall. But just as Laura finished the last touches, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Parker entered the room with a look on her face that Laura hadn't seen before. It wasn't just gratitude or relief. It was something more, something deep and thoughtful. And as she approached, Mrs. Parker reached into her purse, pulling out a small folded piece of paper. "Laura," she said softly, "I've been meaning to tell you something. I've been thinking about this for a while, and I think it's time." Laura's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? She had no idea what Mrs. Parker was about to say, but the way she held the envelope made it feel like something important was coming. I know you're busy, and I know you have your own life, Mrs. Parker continued, her voice steady but warm. But what you did today means more than you could ever know, and because of that, I want to make you an offer. It's something I've been considering for some time, and I think now is the right moment. The room felt like it froze for a second. Laura couldn't breathe, and every part of her mind raced to figure out what Mrs. Parker could possibly mean. Was this about money? Was it a gift? Mrs. Parker held out the envelope, and Laura hesitated. What could she possibly say? What could she possibly do with such an unexpected gesture? But before she could take it, Mrs. Parker gave her a knowing smile and said, "Take it home, think it over, and let me know what you decide." And with that, Mrs. Parker turned and walked back to her chair, as if nothing unusual had happened. But Laura was left standing there, holding the envelope, her mind reeling. What could this offer possibly be? What did Mrs. Parker mean by all of this? And what decision would Laura have to make? With her heart racing, she realized that this Saturday was about to become much more than a simple act of kindness. It was about to lead her down a path she never could have imagined. But one thing was certain. Whatever came next, her life and her relationship with Mrs. Parker would never be the same again. And so, Laura's story took an unexpected turn. What did Mrs. Parker have in mind? As Laura walked out of Mrs. Parker's house that evening, the envelope felt heavy in her hands. She hadn't even opened it, but the weight of what it could mean pressed against her chest. Her mind was swirling with questions, each one more frantic than the last. What could Mrs. Parker want from her? The offer was clearly important, too. Important for a simple thank you card or a casual gesture. Laura wasn't sure what she expected when she walked over to help her elderly neighbor. She had simply wanted to do something nice, something that mattered. But this was something else entirely. A part of her was excited at the thought of receiving an unexpected offer, but another part of her couldn't shake the sense of unease. Why was Mrs. Parker suddenly so eager to make a deal? And what could she possibly want from someone like Laura? The night stretched on as Laura sat on her couch, staring at the envelope in her hands. Her phone buzzed a few times with messages from friends and family, but she couldn't bring herself to respond. How could she explain any of this to them? How could she put into words the strange feeling that had settled in her gut? As much as she tried to tell herself to open the envelope, something kept her from doing it. The anticipation of what it could hold was almost too much to bear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Laura took a deep breath and tore open the flap. Inside, there was a single sheet of paper. As she read it, the words seemed to blur together. Mrs. Parker was offering her something significant. It wasn't money, though. It wasn't a simple gift. It was a proposition that sent a chill through Laura's entire being. Mrs. Parker was offering Laura the chance to move into her house, to live there, in the very space she had just spent the day cleaning. She had explained that her health had been deteriorating and that she couldn't keep up with the upkeep anymore. She wanted someone to take over the house, someone who could care for it, someone who would appreciate it as much as she once did. And in exchange, Mrs. Parker was offering to let Laura live there, rent-free for as long as she wanted, with the only condition being that Laura take care of the house and the small garden out back. Laura could hardly believe it. The offer was more than generous. It was life-changing. For someone like Laura, who had been struggling to make ends meet, this was the answer to all of her problems. The thought of living in a beautiful house, surrounded by peaceful gardens, and away from the noise of city life, was almost too perfect. And Mrs. Parker, so kind and selfless in her offer, was practically giving her the keys to a new life. But there was something nagging at Laura. Something felt off. Mrs. Parker was a sweet, gentle woman, but there was a certain level of desperation in her offer. She had made it sound so easy, as though she was handing over something she no longer wanted or needed. Laura tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered in the back of her mind. Why now? Why was Mrs. Parker offering this to her, of all people? As the days passed, Laura found herself replaying that conversation over and over again, trying to understand the motivation behind it. It didn't add up. Mrs. Parker wasn't struggling financially. Laura knew that much. She had always been careful with her money, and there was no indication that she was in any kind of dire straits. So why was she giving up her home? Why was she offering it to someone she barely knew? Laura couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something she was missing, something that Mrs. Parker wasn't telling her. As much as she wanted to believe in the kindness of her offer, there was an undercurrent of suspicion she couldn't shake. One afternoon, Laura decided to confront her. She couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. She walked over to Mrs. Parker's house, the envelope still clutched tightly in her hand, and knocked on the door. When Mrs. Parker answered, she greeted Laura with her usual warmth, but Laura could see the tiredness in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of something unsaid. "I've been thinking about your offer," Laura began, her voice steady, despite the nerves gnawing at her. "But I need to know why. Why me? Why now?" Mrs. Parker's smile faltered for just a moment before she stepped aside and gestured for Laura to come in. Once inside, she led Laura to the living room, where they sat in silence for a moment. The air felt thick with tension, as if both women were waiting for the other to speak. Finally, Mrs. Parker broke the silence. "I've been thinking about this for a long time, Laura. I didn't know who to turn to, but I've seen how you've always been kind and thoughtful. I know I can trust you." Her voice cracked slightly, and Laura felt a pang of sympathy. Mrs. Parker was clearly struggling with something deeper than just wanting help with her house. But even as she spoke, there was something strange in her tone. It wasn't just sadness. It was fear too. "I'm not sure I understand," Laura said quietly. Her gaze locked on Mrs. Parker's face. "What's really going on here?" For a moment, Mrs. Parker didn't answer. Then with a deep sigh, she leaned forward, her hands trembling slightly. "I'm not just giving you this house because I want to help you, Laura. There's something you need to know, something I've kept secret for years." Laura's heart skipped a beat. The air in the room seemed to grow colder as Mrs. Parker's words hung in the silence between them. What was she about to reveal? What was so important that Mrs. Parker had waited this long to tell her? With a final shaky breath, Mrs. Parker spoke the words that would change everything. "This house is hiding a secret, and I'm afraid that secret might be what's driving me to do this." Mrs. Parker's words hung in the air like a weight, her eyes filled with fear and vulnerability. Laura's heart raced as she leaned forward. Her curiosity piqued, yet a sense of dread slowly settled in her stomach. "What secret? What are you talking about?" Mrs. Parker's hands shook as she clasped them together tightly. Her voice barely a whisper, she started to explain. "This house, it's been in my family for generations, but there's something in the attic, something I found years ago when I first moved in. I didn't know what to do with it, and now I'm afraid it's too late." Laura listened in stunned silence, the weight of the moment sinking in. "Something in the attic," she repeated, almost afraid to ask. Mrs. Parker nodded slowly, her face pale. "I never told anyone. Not my children, not anyone. But over the years, strange things have been happening here. Sometimes I hear footsteps when I'm alone. Other times, I hear whispers at night. I thought it was just my imagination, but I found a box in the attic one day. A box that belonged to the original owner, my great-grandfather. It had strange symbols on it, and ever since I opened it, things have been different. Laura's breath caught in her throat as Mrs. Parker's words grew more urgent. "What's in the box? What's happening here?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "I don't know exactly," Mrs. Parker admitted. "But I'm scared, Laura. It's as if the house is haunted, or maybe cursed. The whispers won't stop. The house seems to have a life of its own, and it's not a good one. I thought if I gave it to someone else, maybe the curse would end. But I think I've made a terrible mistake. I can't live here anymore." Laura's mind was reeling, and for a moment she wasn't sure whether to laugh or run out of the room. Was this real? A haunted house? She couldn't deny that the place had always had an eerie, almost unsettling feeling to it, but hearing it all laid out so plainly, it was almost too much to process. "Why are you telling me this now?" Laura asked, her voice trembling. "Why give me the house if you're so scared?" Mrs. Parker's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what else to do, Laura. You're the only one who has ever been kind to me, who's ever offered to help. I don't want to burden you, but I'm afraid of what's coming next. I've seen too much, and now I'm afraid the house won't let me go. Please take it before it's too late." Laura's mind spun with confusion, and the weight of the decision began to sink in. Could she really accept this offer? Could she risk her own peace of mind, her own safety, to take on the house with its mysteries and its secrets? She had barely known Mrs. Parker before this weekend, and now here she was, standing in the middle of a story that seemed ripped straight from a ghost story. But something within her stirred. The woman before her wasn't asking for money or compensation. She was asking for safety, asking for freedom from something she didn't understand, something that seemed beyond her control. Laura felt the tug of empathy, the desire to help. No matter how strange the circumstances were, she couldn't turn her back on Mrs. Parker now. "I'll help you," Laura said, her voice steady, despite the anxiety bubbling up inside her. "I'll take the house, but we need to figure out what's going on first. We can't just pretend like everything's fine." Mrs. Parker's face softened with relief. "I knew I could count on you, Laura. I'll show you everything I found. Maybe together we can finally put an end to this." The next few days were a blur of cleaning, sifting through the attic, and uncovering old family secrets. The box was real. Laura saw it with her own eyes. It was locked, and as they searched for the key, they discovered that the symbols etched into its surface matched those on the walls in hidden corners of the house. Laura's skepticism slowly gave way to a quiet dread as they uncovered more and more of the mystery. But as they began to piece things together, something strange happened. The whispers stopped. The footsteps ceased. It was as though the house itself had taken notice of their efforts. The tension in the air lifted, and a sense of calm slowly returned. In the end, they never truly solved what the box contained. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. But what mattered most was that they had faced the fear together, and in doing so, had found peace. The house, once a place of secrets and shadows, became a home again. Mrs. Parker moved to a smaller place where she could rest and find comfort in a new chapter of her life. And Laura, she stayed. She took on the house, not as a burden, but as a gift. The offer, once mysterious and full of dread, became the foundation of a bond that would last far beyond what either of them could have imagined. Laura had learned that sometimes the greatest challenges we face are the ones that bring us closer to the people we least expect. And sometimes the key to solving the hardest problems is simply showing up and being willing to face the unknown. In the end, the house wasn't just a place. It was a story. A reminder of the strange, unexpected ways life unfolds. A woman spent her Saturday cleaning a neighbor's home. She didn't know it at the time, but that small act of kindness would lead her into a journey filled with mystery, courage, and an unexpected gift. And for Laura, that was more than enough to change her life forever.